Um, Start with a nice easy one. Do you think drugs have won the war on drugs?
I think since, the vast majority of these drugs do just grow naturally in the ground, and the preparations in which people consume them, kind of miraculously appear all across the world, apart from Antarctica. Yeah, in some way, you can never impose a mere law to, stop a natural process. But, humans have a natural desire also to explore altered states of consciousness, only in, kind of strict, mostly religious states, or that have, imposed kind of real authoritarian police regimes like in the Philippines, does prohibition really kind of work seriously. And even in Pakistan, when much of the world's heroin and opium was really flooding out of Afghanistan in the 80s, suddenly you had 1 million people addicted to heroin and opium. So yeah, I mean, it's a cutesy way of putting it, but yeah, I think Mother Nature always wins, and we'll always survive, long after we've bitten the dust.
That's an interesting way of framing it. So you basically think that, and this is something I'm going to come on to later, but you think the war on drugs was never winnable. You're sort of fighting back against an immutable law of nature, and we're fighting something that is like you say, a sort of primal human instinct to sort of, like you say, explore those altered states of consciousness and have experiences and things like that. I guess
exactly. Yeah. I don't think there's ever really been a kind of successful ban on anything, whether it's sex work, drugs, alcohol, tobacco, the list goes on. Humans desire, to be free is insatiable, and much the same way as nature, but yet these policies still persist. I mean, the Biden administration is backing new fumigation plan in Colombia to spray chemicals all over the coca fields. And I understand that that got up and running in 2021. Maybe it will change now due to the change in presidency in Colombia, but the evidence is already there that this is a very harmful and futile policy, because there's so many bloody fields where you can grow coca anyway, and all that's going to happen is that you're going to disrupt it for a while and poison people and the land in the process.
Yeah, in a very literal sense, I guess that sort of demonstrates what you're talking about in terms of taking on nature, and in that case, like sort of actually just outright destroying it. I think the idea that the war on drugs wasn't and isn't winnable in its very nature is an interesting one that I also sort of picked up in the book when you talk about Noam Chomsky. So I'll just quote what he says. He says that the war on drugs served to frighten the population into obedience as domestic policies were being implemented to benefit extreme wealth at the expense of the large majority. A UN working group talks about the war on drugs being used to justify excessive surveillance, talking about a system of racial control. Obviously, we know that the war on drugs certainly keeps the prison industrial complex in business, and also this sort of like militarized policing. Do you think that's another sort of way in which the war on drugs was never actually meant to be won? It's about, like I say, funding that drugs prison industrial complex, and there's a very large sort of business capitalist element to this.
I don't think it's such a controversial view that in a capitalist society, often the strongest drivers for political change is profit motive. And Nixon's top advisor came out some years later when an illustrious journalist knocked on his door and asked him about everything, and he admitted that they banned marijuana to have a reason to persecute people of color, and they banned psychedelics, LSD, to boot the hippies who were putting up sustained pressure against the Vietnam War. So yeah, I think all these kind of interests have coalesced over this 50 years to mean that there hasn't been, perhaps until now, this significant pressure to stop the drug war, because yeah, as you say, so many institutions are making of it, and including the DEA, which is also now kind of blocking people's access to psilocybin when they're on their deathbed, even though there's this right to try law that's enshrined in US federal legislation that gives people with terminal diseases the right to access any drug if they want to, that's passed phase 1 trial. I quote this other chap in the book, I think a Mexican official in Chihuahua, who says, if you kill all the pests, then there's no pests left for the pest control companies to smite. And also recently, I saw a story from this, I think Morgan, is it Morgan Stanley, the economic company?
Yeah.
They did this briefing, even saying that it might be a bad business model to heal people that driving growth in the pharmaceutical market. So yeah, it's a very difficult situation with this economic system that we have around us. But yeah, I think it's an important right for people to be able to explore the natural world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're getting a sense of from those answers is a sort of like a dialectical relationship between prohibition as a sort of policy choice in general, like you were saying, not only in terms of drugs, but in terms of sort of anything that you try and prohibit, it doesn't really sort of work. And then this idea of freedom, and then obviously this idea of profit seeking and exploitation. And sort of related to that, obviously, you go into quite a lot of detail in the book of sort of the history of drug use and the war on drugs and what drug use looked like before the war on drugs. So talk to me a bit about the history of drug use and drugs and colonialism and how they're linked, because I think you tease that out sort of really quite explicitly, and you show how our attitudes towards drugs that we've sort of had in the West were really sort of shipped out around the world to other cultures where they had a very, very different understanding of these substances.
Yes, well, firstly, I'm very grateful you've read the book. That's kind of you, and I'm very flattered.
Got my notes and everything. Yeah, it was great. It was really good.
Yeah, no, very impressive. Thank you. Yeah, look, around the world, indigenous cultures have, for centuries, thousands of years, explored altered states of consciousness without having a commercial model, right? Whether it's ayahuasca in the Amazon, whether it's iboga in Gabon, whether it's magic mushrooms in Mexico, communities who have kind of preserved their culture over a number of years have had a unbroken relationship with these plants, and indeed some societies in South America, Venezuela, Bolivia, with even corn liquor that's drank on only a very limited number of special occasions, and it is kind of regulated by social mores, even if people do get completely shit-faced a couple of times a year. And what you have is the West arriving in these countries and either trying to ban these substances, like the attempts of the Spanish in Mexico with mushrooms and peyote, or as in Peru, they introduced a commercial model after they realized that prohibition's useless, and these traders lived in Cusco, Spanish, or just off this trade, and the prices went up after they realized that after they banned it, that these chaps didn't work as hard. So yeah, I think like these colonial relationships have been inherently unequal and often totally brutal and indefensible.
Yeah,
And
it's
at
interesting.
times we haven't really had a clear break from that. It's kind of just evolved into a more kind of you know, palatable system.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about the way that they realized that the sort of colonial subjects were not working as hard. And again, I think that talks about the profit motive and the capitalist drive. Like I say, you talk about in your book the globalization of legal and illegal drugs as commodities in an emerging capitalist marketplace, which began in the 17th century. And you're seeing alcohol, tobacco, and caffeinated products already sort of westernized products as they come over here in the 17th century. They get exported around the world, and colonial elites, as they go to these countries, they take their drugs with them, and they other people who are already there and the drugs that they are using.
Yes, but it's kind of yeah, many historical anomalies to how the substances you mentioned became kind of impervious to prohibition. But yeah, I mean, we've paid the price. They call what's happened with tobacco the shaman's curse. That, these guys weren't chain smoking. They were having it on limited occasions, mostly in ceremonies, and with millions of deaths every year still now in the West due to smoking, and its related diseases. We've paid the price.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to look at how those historical quirks, like you say, those random acts of chance have really still have impacted us in the past and are still impacting us today. You touched earlier on Biden, and I know that Biden got a bit of credit. I can't remember exactly what, but something to do with like having harm reduction in some federal legislation or in some document or something or other. But you've pointed out, obviously, that actually it's a lot more complicated than that in terms of policies he's pursuing in the global South, in the American sphere of influence in Latin America. How much do you think people like President Biden, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, these people that we could, arguably label progressives, how much do you think they have to answer for the war on drugs? You got Bill Clinton and his 3-strike system, the huge uptick in the criminalization of young black men in the UK under Blair, as well as the sort of cannabis reclassification debacle under Brown. Do you think, because we focus so much on Nixon and Reagan and blah, 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 do you think we let these sort of Democratic and Labour administrations off the hook?
Yeah, I mean, Nixon obviously declared this war on drugs, but it actually came hand in hand with quite an expanded treatment regime and methadone. And yeah, Clinton is the one that massively expanded the prison industrial complex. Biden was also an influential senator at the time. He introduced the bill that made penalties for crack cocaine 50 times more harsh than for powder cocaine, and given it was mainly people of color that were using crack cocaine, partly because it was cheaper. There's obviously a really striking imbalance there, and that further exacerbated inequalities in the prison system.
That's is it? That's not even a subtle. That's like very explicit sort of discrimination there. Like that's they're not even trying to hide this.
Yeah, I mean, look, maybe it is more subtle. Maybe it is just crack was more new and less known about, and yeah, I guess powder cocaine was already kind of imprinted in people's consciousness, and if you see someone smoking crack, it is a bit more striking than someone doing a line. From living in Bethnal Green, I've seen both.
Yeah, well.
But to be fair to Biden, they did somewhat correct that, and they slightly closed the disparity, but about 20-30 years later. And he's made some encouraging statements regarding cannabis. He recently said he's working on this promise to make sure no one's imprisoned for cannabis offenses, and it seems like under his watch the psychedelic reform is really going to take shape. And yeah, and his son keeps coming into the news. I think that it's an important principle for people to have their privacy. But when you have the son of the president of the United States smoking crack on video, it does raise significant questions, including regarding Biden's involvement in this original reform in the 80s. But then Hunter Biden has also used various supposedly addiction-ending psychedelics like ibogaine and bufo, the toad venom. So it's a very interesting case study. I wonder if he's telling his father about the purported benefits.
Yeah, I think what we've sort of hinted at there, talking about the way that sort of people of color were explicitly targeted in that legislation, and talking about the way that political and cultural elites and their drug use is obviously isn't targeted or punished in anything like the same way that certain sort of groups who are subject to high levels of persecution using the same drugs would be. We've got politicians in the UK who openly admit to using drugs, like you're just giving the example in the US. Doesn't this really prove that the war on drugs is really a war on people? And actually, it's not just a war on people that's a sort of indiscriminate war that's waged. It's actually an asymmetrical one that is applied, that force is applied, with discrimination and targeted specifically at certain groups.
I mean, the war on drugs has given a lot of power to police forces to go about their business in any way they see fit. Proving a crime can be very, very complicated, even if it seems quite clear cut. But if someone smells of cannabis or has a bit of powder in their pocket, that gives law enforcement a very wide remit to impose their power. On the wider point, as I say, there is this quote from the Nixon advisor saying that's why they launched the war on drugs. And
yeah, Ehrlichman.
And as I say, when there's, it seems to me, when there are like real clear cut policies in society that kind of go beyond the pale against typically kind of middle and upper class people, that there's an uproar. And when there's long-standing and new issues relating to poorer people, while there are often significant victories thanks in no small part to the media and certain politicians, just the level of conversation and uproar and debate and attention is just far smaller. And yeah, we're seeing that now on a number of issues, and we're yet to reach that critical kind of mass regarding drug policy that we've seen to some extent on environmental reform, and that's really kind of shifted the Overton window and has changed the way even kind of right-wing politicians talk about things. But I think even 3 or 4 years ago, where did you really think drug policy would be in the place it is today? So yeah, little by little.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And sort of speaking about shifting the Overton window and that sort of a gradual step, one of the first countries to implement sort of quite substantive reform was Portugal in 2001. And obviously they did reach a tipping point. I think it was in terms of deaths and HIV infections as well.
Throughout society, totally throughout society. Whereas in the UK, obviously, yeah, drug use, this problematic kind of drug use that's killing people is obviously largely, obviously not always, but to a great extent, centered in kind of marginalized populations.
Absolutely, yeah. So just expand a bit on Portugal for me. That's obviously the system that I think gets talked about the most, and it's the one that the most people have a sort of vague understanding and awareness of. I think definitely in like UK politics, you do have some politicians who have an idea that something's different in Portugal. They're not exactly sure.
Yes.
So talk to me a bit more about that and your thoughts. Do you think it's been successful? Because you go into it on a couple of pages in the book.
Yes, I mean, Portugal does really receive a lot of attention still now. Every so often, I see, figures in the media and politicians asked about it. And the thing is that after they decriminalized drugs in 2001, death rates and HIV transmission rates plummeted. While there have since been some, ups and downs, it hasn't returned to the same levels by any stretch. And through using the money that they had used for law enforcement, they massively expanded treatment programs to include things provided by the state that would seem even kind of decadent in the UK, like these kind of aquatic exercises that look pretty relaxing, and outreach workers going to real far-flung parts of the country to help people. But we see this in Switzerland to some extent. Switzerland has done some serious decriminalization, so too the Czech Republic, and now increasingly a number of US states are balloting for it, and we're already seeing some of the policies filter through. So there's a growing body of evidence around the world, that decriminalization reduces significantly the harms that are associated with prohibition. But ultimately, it doesn't solve the problem of the market and leaves billions in the hands of criminals who can, contaminate the drugs in search of profit or just reckless abandon, and can corrupt public officials and can use their proceeds to branch out into other areas of crime and buy guns. A friend was telling me recently that, and I take this on good authority, that the police and the military in Portugal are involved, in the drug trade and reselling stuff that's seized at the border. So yeah, it's obviously a better situation than jailing people for mere drug use. But yeah, clearly there's a long way to go.
Okay, and so on that, given that, like you say, it's a bit of a mixed bag, how do you think we're doing in terms of cannabis legalization across the world? Obviously, like you say, an absolute sort of smorgasbord of different models and things like that. Do you think it's sort of vaguely getting the balance right between public health and corporate capture, or do you think that a lot more needs to be done?
Yes, I mean, as you say, it's a total smorgasbord, and it's interesting. Germany seems to be moving towards it now, which will likely have a domino effect across the continent, given that it's the largest economy. But yeah, I mean, you have models in places like Uruguay that have like cannabis social clubs, and have a more social model, as the name might suggest, and allow home growing and these little resales between people, but also you can access it in pharmacies and stuff. There's questions, I understand, over like access across the country, which is still allowed like a kind of black market, just simply because there's not enough of these clubs and pharmacies across the country, as I say. But it seems to be a pretty equitable model on the whole. But then you have some US states where there's no cannabis social clubs, there's no Amsterdam style cafes where people can gather. Well, there's obviously questions over where they're sourcing the weed in Amsterdam, although that's also because they're not allowed to buy legal weed. But yeah, as I say, in America, it's mostly a dispensary model, and black farmers are also priced or blocked from the market. Like in Florida, they introduced by the back door this policy to make sure that only people that had their land for like 30, 40 odd years and had X amount of hectares could get in the market. And yeah, now you kind of seeing the first kind of billboards in. But then in Canada, it's seems to be slightly better, but still a very corporate led model, and actually like it's taken them a long time to get parity with black market sales, because the taxes and the financial barriers to entry were so high, which kind of made the price of the product
Yeah, and I
more
know they've got
expensive.
expungement there as well, haven't they? I guess
Yeah, exactly.
moving
If
on
you're
to,
still going to leave the guys, these guys and women in prison for cannabis offences, it's kind of, doesn't seem to be the most fair situation. But there are some states, that have done better than others. As you say, it's a total smorgasbord.
moving on then, just sort of a personal one for you. What do you think you learned? What was your sort of biggest takeaway from writing the book that you hadn't sort of realized before about drugs and drug policy?
That's a good question.
You don't have to have learned anything. You may have known this all before. You're a wise man.
I mean, it did make me, ponder on, whether the organized crime groups would really take this line down. Obviously, there'd be options, seemingly, might be distasteful to some, of, giving opportunities for former or indeed active criminals to enter the legal market. But certainly in some countries where these groups are totally militarized, one does wonder if they would be so happy with their mouth-watering bounties, being prized away from them. But at the end of the day, I think that these kind of crime groups are very amorphous, and there are other areas that they could sadly move into and change. Obviously, happens very gradually as well, as we see in Canada. Sure, they legalized it, but then it's taken a number of years for the legal sales to get parity. So yeah, that obviously did strike me. And also the sheer process of being approached to write a book, and then it getting published, and then trying to get a bit of attention on it has been an interesting learning curve. But I'm grateful for all the experiences. And as I say, I hope that the book can bring something fresh and original to the conversation. It's only 20,000 words, although my drafts were much longer, and you can read it in a couple of sittings. It's something poppy for the coffee table. And hopefully it opens the kind of conversation to a kind of wider audience. Yes.
Yeah, it's very eye-catching, and obviously I've read a couple of other books in the Big Ideas series, and it is an engaging format. So I guess, like, finally then, you've talked there sort of about the way that organized crime gangs might not take sort of reform lying down, and you talked about the sort of shortcomings of decriminalization models, maybe in general. Given that then, and obviously given that it's the title of the book, should all drugs be legalized?
It's a really tricky question, and I think I would have needed about 90,000 words to have really done it justice. But as we said at the beginning of the conversation, when these coca grows across the Andes, when you have opium growing all across the Middle East and indeed parts of South America, when you have cannabis growing in almost every country in the world, you have magic mushrooms also in most countries in the world. But it's illegal in the UK to pick them.
Yeah.
But it's obviously not illegal to have them growing on your land, because you can't prevent it. It's like a natural process. At least in, like, if you wanted to grow cannabis in the UK, you don't obviously have to like plant the seed. It's not like in India where it's endemic. These magic mushrooms literally just pop out from the ground. So I think with this Netflix documentary, Michael Pollan, and just the general coverage of drug policy in the media and in public consciousness, I think we're getting to this moment where it's more about how can we legalize drugs, because they are being legalized. So there's serious questions over access for lower income and people of communities and people of color, because at the moment it's drugs accessed legally are largely the preserve of white middle class people. And yeah, it's a very, very difficult situation. Obviously, it's informed by economic and factors which are themselves, you know, governed essentially by policy, you know, making them still illegal mostly, and therefore the prices have to be relatively high. But we see Oregon rolling out psychedelic therapy with psilocybin next year, but they're also trapped in this kind of American payer healthcare model. You know, let's wait and see if insurance companies yeah pick up the baton. This or last week, in fact, a store in Holland kind of opened. Some museum curators and campaigners teamed up to make this kind of MDMA store, with three different like options, like a kind of retail model, a pharmacy model, and a more kind of even stricter model where you have to go through kind of like speeders awareness course, I think, to kind of register yourself and prove your credentials. So yeah, the conversation's underway, but you know, I don't think it can happen without discussing alcohol, because you know some seriously strong and dangerous substances are already being sold legally on you know the streets all over the world with varying degrees of freedom. Like in England, you know, many places you can get 24-hour vodka. Like cheap vodka, which you know seems crazy, and you know you just don't see the levels of public drunkenness elsewhere, like in Quebec, where there's a few more safeguards, and it's sold in government shops between certain hours, and it's, you know, you can only really access high quality stuff. So yeah, it's a big conversation to have, but you know, it's not a minute too late.
No, absolutely. Nice one. Well, I think we'll leave it there if that's okay.